Hello and welcome to the Sky is Blue podcast. I'm your host, Jon Enos. This is episode 1. I think it was the famous science fiction novel by Frank Herbert, Dune, that begins with the passage, something to the effect, beginnings are a very delicate time. And I can tell you with full frankness that this beginning, the beginning of this project, Sky is Blue podcast, is a big deal for me. Not for you, the audience, I'm sure, most of which I'll probably have cajoled you, family members, to even tune in. But the process I'm beginning here today is very personal. But I love the idea of things that have multiple purposes and that get multiple things done. So while I'm in the midst of processing some healing and sharing that process, I hope, and I've already received some positive confirmation, that some of you will resonate with some of my perspectives and maybe feel a little bit of hope. If there's any one theme of this podcast that I'd like to emphasize at the beginning, this delicate place, it's the concept of hope, the concept of coming back from a tough time, from a dark space, from possibly even hopelessness. I have made such a journey, and I want to share my story through a series of video essays and podcasts using the medium of confessional memoir, I guess you could say, and to process for myself in my own mind some of the things I've gone through and the work that is yet to come. And if any of this resonates with anyone, wow, that's gravy. That's fantastic. So that's the hope at the beginning. But what even is the Sky is Blue? Why is it called that? What is the point? Let's peel things away by layers, like an onion, a little bit at a time, and reveal. And before I get into the name of the podcast, I thought I'd detour or segue or tap into the notion of names to begin with, and what we name things that we're particularly anxious about. Our children. Things we birth into the world, but then things which take off and which we don't really have control over, right? That's a metaphor for art as well as actual children. But I thought I would start by just telling you the story of my children's names and use that as a launching pad for where this social media, self-expression, dialectical experiment of the Sky is Blue podcast may end up going. So when Santia and I, the mother of my children, were having our first child in the world, we struggled with the problem of names. Now, Santia, my former wife's name, is a beautiful word, first of all, and it's a word that means something in another language, right? So it means twilight in Persian, if I understand correctly. And so we thought, how interesting would it be if we named our kids like she had been named, from a word that meant something in another country for which we had no direct connection to, but which had an impact on us, right? Because that was more or less the story of her name. Santia, a family friend of her mother, gave her that idea. So we started searching. We sent the word out to all of our friends all over the world. We said, we're looking for unusual baby names that are words in languages we don't know that mean something nice and have a lyrical sound to them. And we also thought, Santia, Santia, if we could have words that were sort of similar in shape, to that. So we were setting ourselves up a big challenge, but whatever. We were weirdos and artists and young and confident, so we set ourselves the challenge of that. So we started getting a list of names that we really loved, but of course, we thought we were more edgy and cool than we were. Once the day came to actually giving an unusual name to one of our kids, all of the normal parental things went through our head. What if they're made fun of? What if no one can spell it? Are we dooming our kid, to, whatever. All of those issues. We finally said, well, no, we just have to go for it. And one that had been very much on the top of our list is this beautiful word, Sanyu. Sanyu. It means joy in Ugandan. I think it's absolutely beautiful. And it was definitely at the top of our list. And as I say, we almost left the hospital without a name on the birth certificate because we were so afraid of just going for it, right? Launching into the unknown and giving our child this gorgeous, gorgeous, but uncommon name. So we did. We decided. Well, immediately after calling family, of course, the first person I called was the woman who had given us the idea for the name. Her name was Diane Mogambo, if I recall correctly. And I will admit it has been, nearly 30 years since we've spoken. But Diane and I both worked at MGM studios at the time, 90s. That's how I knew her. And she had come over from Uganda. And we worked in the same department. And so I called her. I just was excited to tell her, we picked your name. And I believe, if I remember correctly, her sister was named Sanyu. And it means joy, and she told us that. So I called her very excited to let her know we'd picked your name, and this baby was born, now an American baby named Sanyu. So I called her. She picks up the phone. Hello. And I dive enthusiastically into my story, of course, thinking only of myself. And I tell her, we picked your name. We picked your sister's name. We've just named our new baby, our first daughter, our first child. We've named her Sanyu. And there was this prolonged silence on the other end of the phone. And to the point where I was like genuinely concerned, like maybe the connection did or something. So I queried, Diane, are you there? Are you all right? And in a muted voice, she said, I've received 2 phone calls today. The first was from my family in Uganda, telling me that my brother has just been killed this morning. And now you are calling me to tell me that a child has been born into the world and given my sister's name. One soul has left the earth, and another has entered. What a day. Now, I should have known then that my life was not going to be normal for the next 25 years. And it wasn't. But we'll get there, one step at a time. So, our amazing, spectacular daughter Sanyu, and if I can coerce her, as soon as I'm brave enough to start having interviews on this show, she will be one of my guests, I dearly hope. And you'll get to meet her. So, our second child. Now, this proved a dilemma. Because when we chose Sanyu, there's something really interesting about the name Sanyu. Right. Sanyu. You see, it's 5 letters, and one of them has a tail. I don't know how to do this in the backwards mirror of my monitor. If you're audio only, I'm actually holding up a sign with the word on it and trying to trace it with my fingers and failing. But we have 5 letters And one of them has a tail, the Y, Sanyu. So we thought, this is the kind of crazy kids we were in the 90s when we had energy. We said, well, okay, we've set ourselves the goal of giving our children beautiful names from other languages or countries from which we don't know what it is, but it's a meaning we like, and that have five-ish letters or so. And then we thought, well, what if we could have them all have a tail in them, right? A Y, a J, one of the taily letters. So we made our challenge quite a bit harder. So baby number 2 comes along, and we are actually in trouble because we've given ourselves this deep challenge, and we're not coming up with anything. And then at one point, I don't actually remember the details. I should have consulted with tSiB before recording this, as an aside, which I'm famous for. Aside. In fact, I thought of calling this podcast "But I Digress." As an aside, well, I'll actually not do that. I'll tell this story later. But anyway, so part of my family, a big chunk of my family, comes from Italy. My mother was an immigrant to America. She came over when she was 19, had me, and then was naturalized when I was 3 years old. So I grew up with, this kind of, the old country was still very much kind of a mystique in my growing up. And so on the Italian side of the family, we have a section of our family that comes from this wonderful region along the Mediterranean coast, if I believe, called Arma di Taggia. And there's an actual fairly big modern city right on the coast, but up in the foothills, the kind of the mountain region right there on the Mediterranean, is the ancient village, Taggia. And it's a gorgeous place. And I visited there with some of my cousins, and I'll tell that story later. But it hit me that Taggia was such a beautiful name, a word that just rolled off the tongue. And we thought, wow, what an interesting name. So we were turning that around, except the problem is it's spelled Taggia, and we were like, no, there's no way, because in America people look at that and they go Taggia, and we just wait, no, she's going to get reamed over the coals as a kid. We said, but what if we spelled it phonetically, Tadja, to get the Taggia, that whatever, that diphthongy kind of thing. Tadja, and it would fulfill our contract of the 5-letter names and be amazing and be a reference to part of where her ancestors came from the old country, Taggia. So we did, and the second time we were much more confident, and we just dove into it, and it has been wonderful the whole time. All right, well, then child number 3 comes along, and we're like, okay, boy, oh man, we are definitely in trouble, because now we're locked into this 5-letter thing, a word from another language that means something cool that's not our language, that has a tail in it. Oh, God. Like, how many words are there like that in the world? So we put out a request. We just sent it out. We said, you know what? Put it out to the universe. If it's important, it'll come back. So we put out the call. We said, oh, you know what? I wanted to tell the story of Taggia's birth too, but I'll do that later. I'll write myself a note. So we put it out there. We needed a third name, and people started sending us actually pretty cool advice. I can't talk and write at the same time, apparently. Yeah, multitasking, which will probably be an episode all by itself called multitasking. I don't believe in it. Anyway. One of our friends, I believe, if I'm remembering the story correctly, was tootling around Europe, doing the youth hostel thing, and was in Albania and texted. This was a very dear friend of our family, a close friend of my oldest sister. He texted her. I think she had sent out the call to her friends as well. He texted her and he goes, you know what? I'm in this little village in Albania, and I've just learned that Arjan, spelled with a J, Arjan, means son of John. my name is Jon. So we were like, wow, amazing, Arjan. And with the J, pronounced Y, we had our letter, we had everything. It was perfect. So we said, absolutely, Arjan, son of Jon. Of course, it's a strange, sensitive, delicate, in fact, kind of feminine name. So, we had some doubts, we had some hesitation, a little. But no, by this point, we were confident. Go for it, Arjan. So, here's what they look like. If those of you seeing the video, if I can figure out technically how to post a video. Sanyu, Taja, Arjan, our children's names. So, Joy, Taja, small town in Italy, and the son of Jon. Anyway, we were pretty excited about that as young parents. But right after Arjan's birth, and he was born perfect and wonderful, we were recovering in our room in the hospital, and we heard a knock at the door. And it was a nurse who wasn't from our floor. We had not met her yet. We hadn't seen her in the delivery area. And she came in. She said, I want to meet the God. Something to that effect. And we were like, what? She says, yes. She says, I saw on the birth manifest the names, and I saw Arjan, that you had named your child Arjan. And I came to see him. And we were like, we don't understand. She goes, yeah. And she figured, she saw we were just, white kids, Americans. And she was from India. And she said, well, in Hindi, there's a god named Arjun. And he's a very big deal, right? And it's spelled Arjan. Arjuna. There's a lot of different pronunciations, apparently, as far as I know. I don't know anything about this. But Arjun, she says, is the young god. I wanted to come see him. Because it's not every day you see Arjun has been born into the world, right? From her perspective. We were blown away. We were spiritual. We still are, but we were very engaged in a religious life and a spiritual life at the time, and already had a kind of a built-in sense of mysticism. And when this woman came up, quite serious, saying, Arjan, that is a god's name in my tradition. You have just named your child after a deity in a tradition that you didn't even know existed in your funny letter combination that you didn't even know about. You think it's Albanian, but actually, it's from India. And he's a god. Again, I should have known that our lives were not going to be standard operating procedure at that point. And of course they weren't. Today, the day that I'm recording this live, it won't be the day that I release, but it is the day that I am recording, is January 14th, 2003. January 14th is the anniversary of the death of my son, Arjan, the young god. He died 3 years ago. And for 3 years, for longer than that, but certainly for 3 years, I have been in an emotional and creative and spiritual doldrum, a cul-de-sac, a holding pattern, a healing space, frankly. Because Arjan's death was not just him passing out of the world in material form, but it somehow archetypally and symbolically marked for me the end of a deeply trying, troubling, and challenging 20-year period of my life where my family, myself, and my children in particular were hit with a series of absolutely unbelievable bad luck, tragedies, crises, including violence. Our family was just assaulted for about 20 years. And I will little by little, one episode at a time, one layer at a time, tell those tales, because I think they're instructive. But what they did to me was more or less crush me down into a very dark place where I was close to being unable to function. I kept a day job going because I had to provide for my children. But that was about all I was able to do. It took all my energy to have a pretense of normality, a mask that I would wear in public, and then I would come back into my wounded space, and it was not a particularly great time. And I was rather astonished that I had folded under the pressure as much as I had. My self-image was quite an illusion, but I had a false confidence in it, and it was surprising when it failed to materialize. That I simply wasn't I wasn't as capable as I thought I was. And so I fell into a period of deep depression and heightened anxiety and PTSD and amplification of my lifelong symptoms of Asperger-y, spectrum-y neurodivergence that I've dealt with my whole life, which we'll talk about in a future episode. So, at some point toward the end of that 20 years, I just realized I wasn't going in a direction I wanted to go, and I said, I want to bounce back. I want to come back from this. And not just for myself, but because I have children who are also suffering and trying to come back from their own challenges, and they need example, and they need a dad, and they need someone to come to. And so I had responsibilities, and I said, listen, get off your ass. Figure out your life. My son's 20 years are at the beating heart of a resurrection, a complete transformation that could not have happened had it not been as intense and hard as it was. It's so big a subject that we'll have to take it, as I say, in layers, a little bit at a time, looking at the same story from different angles and teasing it apart. So I hope you'll bear with me, and if you're interested, stick with me over the course of these unfolding episodes. I'd like to segue now. Since it is the anniversary today, January 14th, of our boy Arjan's passing, I'd like to read to you the essay that I wrote very shortly after that event 3 years ago. And I hope you'll forgive me for reading, those of you who are watching the video. But this will put it in a less rambling way than I want to do extemporaneously. This was written, just for context, in August of 2000, so a few months after my son's death. A few months had gone by, and I was able to process it enough to write something for our friends and family. So this was written on the first birthday that he wasn't here with us. He would have been 21 in August of 2020. So that's when I wrote this. This essay is entitled, Arjan at 21. 21 years ago today, our boy Arjan was born perfect in every way. He had a high birth weight, over 9 pounds if I recall. So he was developmentally advanced. He slept well. He ate well. Within 2 weeks, he was able to focus his eyes on our faces and smile. Like I said, advanced. At 17 days old, everything changed. Arjan became fussy in the night and wouldn't feed. He was irritable and troubled. By dawn, he was visibly ill, and we called for an emergency visit to his pediatrician. By the time we got him to his pediatrician, I guess this was maybe 8 a.m., the doctor took one look and immediately called an ambulance to transfer him to the ER. In just a few hours, Arjan had developed petechiae, which is a mottled discoloration of his skin, which is caused by microbleeds. We didn't know that at the time, but it's a classic sign of a systemic infection. By the time Arjan got to the ER, I guess this was about 9 a.m. now, the doctor there took one look at him and immediately called Life Flight to transfer him to UC Davis Medical Center, where they have all the equipment in a pediatric intensive care unit. That blotchy look had gotten much worse just in the drive over from the pediatrician. While waiting for the helicopter, they decided to take a spinal tap. This was 1999 in a small-town ER. Maybe things were more lax back then because I was asked, as his dad, to hold Arjan still while the doctor performed the procedure. He expertly inserted the needle. Almost immediately, a thick white fluid, not unlike curdled milk, started to fill the collection tube. The doc flashed a look up at my face, checking my expression to see if I understood what that gobby white fluid meant. Just as fast as he glanced up, he looked away again, back down at the needle. I said, "That's supposed to be clear, isn't it?" He nodded. He was a young guy, probably a dad himself. He couldn't speak, so he nodded. Yes, friends and neighbors, the CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, should in fact be clear. Anything that looks like curdled milk should not be in your spinal column. That curdled milk was Group B Streptococcus bacteria. It's a common bug, although a particularly nasty one. Nobody is sure how he got it. Years later, it would invade my body as well. A story I'll tell in a future episode. Nobody is sure how I got it either. It infected the bursa in my elbow, and it knocked me on my ass for a month. That's a story for another time. They wouldn't let us ride with Arjan in the helicopter. They sent us home to pack with instructions to meet him at the PICU. It's just as well it saved us the trauma, because on the way to the hospital, Arjan crashed. His heart stopped beating. Fussy and sick at 8 a.m., he was dead by noon. They shocked his heart and revived him. By the time Santia and I got to the hospital a couple hours later, Arjan was hooked up to fluids and monitors, a tiny child in the center of a science fiction set of wires and tubes and flashing lights. We were stunned to see that his body had turned black from lack of circulation. The same microbleeds which had caused that weird-looking petechiae on his skin were also causing all of his blood vessels to leak. Almost as fast as they were pumping fluid in, it was spilling out from his damaged capillaries into the cavities, making his body swell up like a bloated black frog. "It's the pink watch," a nurse told us days later. "What's that?" we asked. "Watch for the pink. Anything that doesn't turn pink again gets cut off." That sounds cruel, but there's a mercy in it. They give parents the easier things to worry about so they don't worry about the bigger things that are no longer on the table. We watched our son slowly turn pink again, all worried about the possibility that his fingers or toes might have to be amputated. But in fact, the bigger realization, which did not sink in for some time, was that while his skin would eventually return to its natural-born hue, his brain would never recover. Over the next 10 days, from his chest outward to his extremities, he slowly faded back to pink. He slowly shrank from a big, bloated frog back to a baby boy. At 5 days into our hospital stay, our first hospital stay, I should say, I was feeling pretty low. I was sitting in the waiting room next to a woman who was also there with her child. She had been there 5 months. Her kid had Down syndrome. I'd only been there 5 days. A new reality was beginning to dawn on me. We would never be going back to Kansas again. We had joined the club of parents with disabled children. The new century brought us a new normal. Since this is an essay and not a novel, although that might be coming, I'll skip 99% of the details. Those first 3 years were a blur anyway. I seriously have very few memories of that time. It was like PTSD from a war zone. I have selective amnesia. Eventually, after a long time, we got help. We got training, and we got used to it. Our Jon healed enough so that his nerves were no longer so ravaged that he screamed every time he was touched or moved. And we entered a phase of several good years. Our Jon would smile when you sang good morning to him. He would grin and giggle when tickled. He went from being an angry Captain Furious to a happy, if disabled, child. But unfortunately, his seizure activity continued to increase to such a point that it was nearly constant. 12 grand mal seizures a day. We had to begin the long, arduous course of drugging him to suppress the seizures. Sadly, the medication suppressed other things as well, like smiley mornings and giggling tickle fests. Our Jon's life got harder as he got older, but he almost never got sick again until the very last years. He was a fighter and a warrior, an indomitable presence at the center of our family's life. Everyone who met him was changed. He should not have lived 20 years. Most kids in his condition never make it to double digits. He was so much of an anomaly that at the end, in his final hospital stay, nurses trained to treat adults were startled by him. They had never seen anyone like him. Technically an adult, they nevertheless had to steal gowns and other materials from the pediatric wing because nothing would fit him. He never stopped being a very big kid. He stuck around for a reason. He was here to change lives. He succeeded. In the end, he stayed longer than he was probably scheduled to, out of kindness, a courtesy to us, out of love. He let us get through Sonia and Connor's wedding and the year-end holidays. He let us end 2019 as best we could. He passed away peacefully in his mother's arms this past January, and we are still not used to the world without him in it. We are never going back to Kansas, kids. Here we are again at the start of a new decade, trying to figure out a new normal. I'm sorry to say this, but all of you out there running around with your hair on fire about COVID and politics and social justice and corruption and all the madness of the world, I don't have much time for you. All those things are valid, and I'm glad somebody's talking about it, but all the available space in my head most days is filled with other concerns. My normal was shattered in January 2020, not March. My dad died in February of 2020, just as rumors of a mysterious pneumonia from China were barely a blip on the radar. Really, normal changed for me back in August of 2019 when my mother died, or in March of 2019 when Sesame died, my dog, and psychically prepared me for this whole thing. Come to think of it, normal started to unravel a whole year before the world's did. Hell, my normal got broke 21 years ago. I guess, metaphorically, I have already been vaccinated against disaster and change. It doesn't surprise me much anymore. My perspective, having lived very closely with death recently, has been to focus not on the broken things of this world, but on the beautiful. Our Jon was both broken and beautiful. If he taught me anything, and of course he taught me much, he taught me this. Forgive your life. Forgive yourself. Forgive others. Love. Find beauty in brokenness. Find it everywhere. See, it is here, right in front of you, always. More to come on future episodes. Thank you for joining me. And I want to make the habit of ending every episode with a prayer of hope. If any of you out there are struggling under your own personal tragedies or difficulties or disadvantages, I feel your pain. You're not alone. There are people that'll help you, and you can change your life. Things can get better. Things do get better. Give it a chance. You can make it. Ciao, my friends.